In the world of crime, some cases stand out not because of their brutality, but because they make us question everything we think we know about justice, family, and human nature. These are the cases where the lines between right and wrong blur so dramatically that it's hard to know where to stand. The story we are about to dive into is one of those cases, one that has captivated Russia and the world, leaving people divided and questioning the truth. This is the story of three sisters, Maria, Angelina, and Christina, who, in the summer of 2018, brutally murdered their father, Mikhail Kachaturian, a 57-year-old man. At first glance, it's a simple tale of betrayal. The daughters, the very people who should have loved and protected their father, instead ended his life. They stabbed him multiple times in a rage that seemed beyond reason. This was no momentary lapse of judgment, but a carefully calculated act. The question that haunted everyone's mind was, why? Why would three daughters do this to their father? On the surface, it appears to be a horrifying crime, a case of familial breakdown gone terribly wrong. However, as the investigation unfolded, a darker, much more disturbing reality came to light. This wasn't just a case of children turning against their father in an unprovoked act of violence. This was the result of years of abuse, emotional, physical, and psychological. A lifetime of terror, manipulation, and unthinkable mistreatment by a man who was supposed to protect, provide, and love his family. Instead, Mikhail Kachaturian, a man who appeared normal on the outside, was a living nightmare for his daughters. The girls' decision to murder their father wasn't spontaneous. It was the culmination of years of suffering, oppression, and abuse that slowly eroded their mental and emotional well-being. They had endured unimaginable horrors at the hands of a man they once called their father, a man who terrorized them and their mother with impunity. But here's where it gets even more complicated. As shocking as the crime was, many people in Russia, ordinary citizens, not experts or professionals, saw the sisters not as murderers, but as victims. They viewed their actions not as cold-blooded violence, but as a desperate plea for freedom from a hellish existence. So, why did the public, and even some within the legal system, express such understanding towards these girls? What made this case so unique that it ignited a debate about justice, victimhood, and the role of family in Russian society? To understand this, we need to look closely at the Kachaturian family's history, the years of hidden abuse, manipulation, and control. The details of their lives were far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Let's take a deeper look into the Kachaturian family's story, one that spans years of terror, fear, and suffering. A story that, once uncovered, forces us to reconsider the very nature of justice. Mikhail Kachaturian and his wife, Aurelia, met in Moscow in the early 1990s. At the time, Mikhail was 34 years old, and Aurelia was a mere 17. Mikhail was wealthy, connected to the criminal world, and had a certain charisma that drew Aurelia in. Aurelia, on the other hand, was a young girl, looking for a place in the world. She came from a modest background, and when Mikhail offered her and her mother a place to stay, she had little reason to decline. What seemed like an innocent offer turned into a nightmare almost immediately. Mikhail, despite his outward charm, turned out to be a violent and controlling man. Shortly after they moved in together, Mikhail began to show his true nature. He physically and emotionally abused Aurelia. He didn't care that she was pregnant with his child. In fact, his cruelty only escalated. This was not a relationship built on love, but one rooted in control, fear, and domination. Aurelia was trapped. She had nowhere to go, and Mikhail's strong ties to the criminal underworld made it impossible for her to seek help. As their relationship deepened, Mikhail continued to assert dominance over Aurelia, forbidding her from leaving the house or even contacting her family. He kept her isolated from the outside world, emotionally and physically abusing her at will. When their son, Sergei, was born, things only got worse. Mikhail suspected that Sergei might not be his biological son, and this fueled his rage. Over time, his anger shifted from Aurelia to the children they had together. By the time their daughters Christina, Angelina, and Maria were born, Mikhail's behavior had become even more erratic. He treated them with a mix of coldness and occasional affection, but this was overshadowed by his cruel and oppressive actions toward their mother. Mikhail began restricting his daughters' freedoms, subjecting them to the same control and isolation he had imposed on Aurelia. His demands were simple but suffocating. The girls were to stay at home, do the household chores, and serve his every need. Mikhail monitored their every move. He installed cameras in their home to ensure they were always under his watch. He placed a bell in their rooms that would signal when he needed them to come to him, and if they were ever disobedient, he would punish them physically. His abuse knew no bounds. It was a life lived in constant fear, with no escape. The girls, who were once vibrant and full of life, slowly became prisoners in their own home. Their once innocent childhoods were overshadowed by the oppressive atmosphere created by their father. They had no friends, no social life, and were forced to stay home at all times. As the years went by, Mikhail's behavior grew increasingly disturbing. Not only did he continue to terrorize his wife and children, but he also began to exhibit signs of more extreme, predatory behavior. He made inappropriate advances toward his daughters, sexually abusing them. For years, the sisters suffered in silence. They didn't know where to turn, and they were afraid to ask for help. Mikhail's ties to the criminal underworld ensured that they were trapped, with no hope of rescue. As his abuse grew more extreme, the girls became more desperate. They had no way out. They could not escape because they feared for their lives. They knew that their father had the power to destroy them, and they had no one to turn to for help. The police, who Mikhail had strong connections with, ignored their cries for help. Their mother, broken by years of abuse herself, was too fearful and powerless to protect them. The family was living in a cycle of violence, and it seemed that there was no way out. By 2018, the situation had reached its breaking point. Mikhail's behavior had become more erratic and violent. He had pushed Aurelia out of the home, and the girls were left to fend for themselves under his constant watch. They lived in a state of constant fear, knowing that any moment could bring another burst of violence. But everything changed in July 2018. Mikhail, who had been in and out of psychiatric hospitals for his violent tendencies, returned home after a stay at a treatment facility. Upon his return, he became enraged when he saw that the house wasn't clean enough to his standards. He accused the girls of overspending his money. In a fit of rage, he sprayed pepper spray in their faces and, in a particularly vicious act, caused Christina, the eldest, to faint. This was the final straw. After years of abuse, isolation, and terror, the girls finally decided that they had had enough. They knew their father kept a knife in the car, so they went downstairs to retrieve it. They found a hammer among the household tools. They waited for Mikhail to fall asleep in his rocking chair, and then they made their move. Angelina struck first, using the hammer to hit her father. Maria, the youngest, used the knife. Christina, who was struggling to breathe from the pepper spray, sprayed her father in the face once again. The girls attacked with everything they had, driven by years of pent-up fear and anger. Mikhail staggered out of the apartment, bleeding from multiple wounds. But he didn't make it far. Angelina took the knife from Maria's hands and stabbed him in the heart. Mikhail collapsed on the stairs and died almost immediately. At that moment, the sisters realized the enormity of what they had done. They had killed their father, the man who had tortured them for so long. But even in the wake of their father's death, they still had no way to escape their nightmare. The girls decided to fake an attack, claiming that Mikhail had attacked them first and that they were only defending themselves. But this story didn't hold up when the police investigated further. The truth, as it turned out, was far darker. The sisters were not cold-blooded murderers, but victims who had been pushed beyond the limits of what any human should endure. The investigation uncovered years of abuse, harassment, and manipulation, revealing a truly tragic family dynamic. And yet, as shocking as it was, the public found themselves sympathizing with the girls. Many saw them not as criminals, but as survivors. Now, as we delve deeper into the story, we will explore how the legal system, society, and the public reacted to the Kachaturian case. But one thing is clear: the Kachaturian sisters' decision to kill their father. The Kachaturian sisters' act of violence reverberated through the media, sparking not only a criminal investigation but also a public outcry and a debate that reached far beyond Russia. The nature of the crime itself was grotesque: 3 daughters brutally murdering their father, but what made this case stand apart was the overwhelmingly sympathetic response from the public. While many were still in shock over the violence, there was a widespread belief that the sisters' actions were understandable, even justifiable, given the years of suffering they had endured. In the days following the murder, social media exploded with both support and criticism. Hashtags like #Justice for the Kachaturian sisters began trending, with people across the country and even internationally expressing their admiration for the girls' bravery in taking matters into their own hands. Many people pointed to the long-standing history of abuse in the family as a key factor in their empathy for the girls. There was a collective understanding that this wasn't a simple case of cold-blooded murder, it was a crime born out of years of unspeakable trauma and desperation. News outlets, particularly those in Russia, followed the case closely, providing daily updates as the investigation progressed. Forensic experts confirmed that Mikhail Kachaturian had been violently attacked, with multiple stab wounds, blunt force trauma, and signs of strangulation. However, despite the brutality of the crime, the authorities found evidence of the girls' abuse, physical and psychological scars, testimonies about their father's violent behavior, and even video recordings of Mikhail's threats. It became increasingly clear that this wasn't a situation of mere familial dysfunction, it was a story of sustained abuse, intimidation, and coercion that had, over time, driven these young women to their breaking point. However, while public opinion was largely sympathetic to the sisters, the legal system had to consider the crime through the lens of Russian law, which doesn't easily accommodate such nuanced interpretations of justice. Mikhail's death, no matter the provocation, was still murder in the eyes of the law, and the sisters would have to stand trial for it. As the case made its way through the legal system, the question that loomed was whether or not the girls would be treated as victims of abuse or as perpetrators of violence. The defense argued that the murder was an act of self-defense, a final attempt to protect themselves from a man who had tormented them for years. They pointed to the psychological trauma they had endured as a mitigating factor, hoping to make the case that the girls had been pushed beyond their limits. On the other hand, the prosecution sought to present the crime as a premeditated act. They noted the calculated manner in which the girls planned and executed the attack, including the fact that they had waited for their father to fall asleep before launching their attack. The prosecution's argument hinged on the idea that, no matter the circumstances, The girls had made the conscious decision to kill their father, and they had done so with intent. This led to a fascinating and highly controversial legal debate about whether a person can be justified in taking the life of another in extreme circumstances, especially when it involves abuse. Many legal scholars, human rights activists, and psychologists joined the conversation, providing differing opinions on what constitutes self-defense, and whether prolonged trauma could indeed be a form of psychological self-defense in extreme cases like this one. Despite the tension, public support for the sisters remained strong, and this sentiment was mirrored by some in the legal community. Their defense attorney, a woman who had long advocated for victims of domestic violence, presented a compelling case to the jury. She argued that the girls had been living in a constant state of terror, and that their father's violent behavior had created an atmosphere of psychological captivity that left them with no options. It wasn't that they wanted to kill their father, they were simply fighting for their survival, just as anyone would if they were trapped in a similarly toxic and abusive environment. At one point, the defense called upon a psychologist who had worked with the girls during the investigation to testify to the lasting impact of their father's abuse. She explained how Mikhail had created an environment where his daughters were not only physically imprisoned but emotionally manipulated. He had convinced them that they were worthless, isolated from the world, and completely dependent on him. This isolation was compounded by the ongoing threats, the physical beatings, and the cruel treatment. The psychologist's testimony painted a grim picture of a family where love and trust had been replaced with fear, coercion, and domination. But public opinion shifted slightly as this psychological evidence came to light. Many people who had initially viewed the girls as murderers began to sympathize with them even more. This wasn't a simple case of children rebelling against their father. This was the story of three young women who had been broken, physically and emotionally, by a man who was supposed to protect them. Their act of violence wasn't an impulsive outburst but the result of years of torment. After a tense trial that lasted several months, the court reached a verdict that surprised many. While the jury ultimately found the sisters guilty of murder, they did not impose the harshest penalties. Instead, they took into account the long history of abuse and the psychological trauma the girls had endured. The judge sentenced them to a reduced prison term, with the possibility of parole after serving a few years. Many in the public saw this as a victory not just for the girls, but for the recognition of the deep, lasting scars left by abuse. In the end, the Kachaturian sisters' case did more than just expose the horrors of family violence. It forced a larger conversation about justice, the role of the legal system in protecting victims, and the way society views both perpetrators and victims of abuse. The case became a symbol for many of the unseen, unspoken realities of domestic violence, realities that often go unnoticed until it's too late. But the Kachaturian case was not over after the verdict was handed down. In fact, it became a touchstone for further legal reforms in Russia regarding how domestic abuse cases are handled. The sisters' trial, and the public's reaction to it, sparked a broader movement to re-examine how society defines justice for victims of extreme abuse, and what happens when the abused take matters into their own hands. The most haunting question that lingers in the aftermath of the Kachaturian case is not whether the sisters should have killed their father, but rather whether they had any other choice. The girls, despite their violent act, are seen by many as victims who were driven to an irreversible point of no return. The real crime, many argue, was not just the murder of Mikhail Kachaturian, but the neglect, the manipulation, and the torment that these girls endured for years. While no one can truly justify murder in its entirety, the case reveals a far deeper issue, one of societal complacency and systemic failure to protect the vulnerable. The real tragedy of the Kachaturian case lies not just in the bloodshed, but in the fact that 3 young women were forced to make the unimaginable decision to end the life of their abuser, their father. For many, the Kachaturian sisters were not the criminals they were portrayed to be. They were victims who had been pushed too far, and for them, there was no turning back. As we step away from this case, it leaves us with more questions than answers. Are there ever truly justifiable murders in a world where the abused feel their only recourse is to fight back against their tormentor? How do we balance the concept of justice with the need for compassion? The Kachaturian case remains a powerful, painful reminder that sometimes, the true victims of a crime are not the ones who commit the act, but the ones who are left broken in its wake. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and comment. What would you have done in Ravi's situation? Let us know your thoughts, and stay tuned for more stories of love, betrayal, and the human spirit.